I'm the president of Just World Educational, which has organized this fine evening of amazing experts and resource people, and so we can have a good discussion. Because our country is bombing, we think 6 or 7 countries in the Middle East right now, depends on how you define the Middle East. And
how you define country.
Bombing, we know. And there's just been woefully little discussion about that in the country, or awareness, or opposition. Although in the countries that are getting bombed, the situation is really dire. So I'm really delighted that the Peace and Social Concerns Committee of the Charlottesville Friends meeting is co-sponsoring this, and also the Charlottesville Center for Peace and Justice. The CCPJ has another couple of events coming up that they want me to bring to your attention. One is that Joseph Stiglitz is talking tomorrow at 7 p.m. at the Performing Arts Center, and on Saturday at noon there's a session on nuclear war that is at the City Council chambers. So without further ado, I will just say, if you don't know anything about Just World Educational, you can find our brochure over there, and you can see the books written by these fine people and buy them and get them signed. So first of all, I'll call on Sheila Carapico, who is a professor of political science at University of Richmond, very distinguished scholar of Middle East affairs, and the author of a great book that you can see over there called Arabia Incognita. I guess it's here, her book. She edited it, she contributed many of the essays and articles that are in it. She pulled together some amazing visuals for the book. The most important one that I like is this, and we can pass these around or people can look at them. These are the per capita GDPs for all the countries on the Arabian Peninsula. And you may be familiar with countries like Qatar and Kuwait and how rich they all are, and then that is Yemen, which just really, I think, explains a lot about the situation of the people of Yemen. But anyway, the book has a lot of other great visuals in it, including this, which shows you where all the US military bases are in the Arabian Peninsula and around it. Yemen is, I cross-hatched it with red. So later we could, pass these around or do whatever, but for now, I'll leave the floor to you, Sheila.
Thank you so much, Helen, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm just going to say a few things about the current war in Yemen, and I get myself pretty upset every time I do it. So on the one hand, I'm angry, and on the other hand, I'm sad. And I think that's the experience of anyone who's watching this closely, which of course is relatively few people. So even in a progressive kind of anti-war group like this, frequently people are not paying attention to the Yemen war. Even among Middle East scholars, there's kind of an amazing lack of recognition of what's going on. So I think it's my job, frequently to tell a pretty simplified version, a basic story of what is going on, emphasizing, and I think this is of course important for those of us who live in the United States, emphasizing the American role in what is now, I think, widely considered to be one of the 4 great humanitarian catastrophes unfolding at the beginning of 2017. So this is, we just decided March 23rd. On the 25th of March, so day after tomorrow, in 2015, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia launched a bombing campaign in Yemen. So going back to the chart that Helena showed, and it's a Saudi-led campaign, so it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I really think of it as the royal family bombing a very poor country. And so I think one point that I would like to really kind of emphasize is it is for sure a war by the filthy rich against the desperately poor. And in particular, you know, the people who are suffering the most are, in a poor country, the poorest of the poor. So it's a Saudi-led campaign, that's the way it's usually referred to. It's predominantly fought from the air with weapons purchased from the United States and the United Kingdom and other, of course, NATO countries. And, you know, the Obama administration was kind of actively and enthusiastically rearming, selling new weapons from the beginning of this campaign. And visited Saudi Arabia a couple of times after the campaign began in order to continue to sell weapons. So it's something which has been very much supported from Washington. The Saudi campaign, or the Saudi claim, which is also widely repeated, I think, in the by journalists who are not actually on the ground trying to figure out exactly what's going on, but just sort of telling a simplified story. The simplified story is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was very upset by the Iran nuclear deal, and that's somehow why they decided to start bombing Yemen. Because their claim is that the people that they are fighting against, which is a militia group known as the Houthis, are Iranian-backed, and the kind of conventional narrative, I think, again, by people who are not actually following things very closely, is that the reason why the Obama administration has backed this kind of brutal air campaign is in order to make friends with the Saudis, that somehow there was some tension in this relationship, that we needed to kind of support them in, you know, war crimes in order to not make them not be angry because we had a negotiated deal. You can tell by the way I'm telling this that I don't really buy that version of the story. For one thing, at the beginning, 2 years ago, the evidence of Iranian support for the Houthi rebels was really weak. There's no question that the Iranian propaganda machine, including Press TV, does cheer that side. But until very recently, the rumors of them using Iranian weapons have not been substantiated. There are no photographs, there are no eyewitness accounts, there's no credible evidence. It's just a claim. Okay, so background to what was going on in Yemen, and again, very briefly, it's a very political circumstance. Yemen was one of the so-called Arab Spring or Arab uprising countries. So Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Libya, 5 countries where dictators had been in power for about 3 decades, who were grooming their sons to take over, and there was a lot of frustration, and there was, in the case of Yemen, I personally was living in Cairo at the time, in the case of Yemen, in a mass public uprising, similar slogan to the ones in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere, which was Ishab Yurid Iskat al-Nizam, the people want to get rid of the regime. The Yemeni uprising was amazing for various reasons. One thing is Yemenis are very heavily armed, and people threw down their weapons in order to protest peacefully, and they did that for months and months and months. Another thing was that women were really conspicuously active. The person who got the Nobel Peace Prize representing the so-called Arab Spring was a Yemeni woman. You can find her speaking to crowds of thousands, which in the Arabian Peninsula is pretty striking. especially given that the countries that are attacking Yemen are places where women aren't allowed to say anything in public, much less stand up in front of thousands and thousands of people and lead a mass uprising. The transition didn't go well, and I don't want to get down in the weeds on this, except to say that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies, particularly the United Arab Emirates, were terrified. They were terrified by the uprising in Tunisia, which is very far away. They were terrified by the chance of real regime change in Egypt, which is still kind of far away. The prospect of an actual democratic, feminist, youth, progressive movement with socialist elements and social justice elements on their very doorstep in a country with at least as many citizens as the Gulf Cooperation Council countries have was terrifying. They tried to impose, they did create a transition government. Again, I don't want to sort of get lost in the specific details, which failed. And at some point, this kind of ragtag militia from the far north near Saudi Arabia basically walked into the capital, and the transitional government fled. And in the events, they fled to Riyadh and said, help restore us. That government now, the leader's name is Hadi, and he is referred to, if you read the conventional press, as the quote-unquote internationally recognized government. In other words, the Saudi puppet, who is also, of course, recognized by the United States. Yemen, I didn't say this yet, its population about 27 million. So some people imagine it to be really itty-bitty, but it's actually not that much smaller than Syria or Iraq, and as large as Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis have been bombing, or the Saudi-led coalition, and again, the United States is not only selling weapons, but also providing services like in-air refueling and helping a naval blockade, which prevents goods and services, or goods in particular, from coming into the country. So there's a blockade on the ports. The airports are all shut. The Saudis have been bombing hospitals, schools, bridges, water supply, electricity supply. Of the 27 million, groups like Oxfam and others are estimating something like 20 million are food deprived. Very significant numbers are facing actual starvation. And I would add that what I can tell by looking at the pictures and the precise coordinates of what's going on, it's the coastal people in the Red Sea region who tend to be very dark and who are, to begin with, the sort of least privileged and poorest segment of the population who are bearing disproportionately the brunt of this air campaign. There's these very poor black Yemenis who are in the Red Sea region who are bearing disproportionate costs of the blockade, and therefore the starvation and also the air campaign, are not Shia. So the Saudi story, which is, well, we're bombing these people because they're Shia and they're pro-Iranian, but actually most of the victims are not Shia and have nothing to do with Iran. So it's a kind of meta-narrative, but with a certain self-fulfilling element to it. Then, of course, even before this, the United States was already actively engaged in a drone campaign against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And Al-Qaeda, of course, taking for a moment the sectarian narrative, they are Sunni, and so are the Saudis. So there's, in making their air campaign sectarian, and opinions differ whether this was just very poor planning or very poor strategy or whatever, or deliberate. In any case, the Saudi-led air campaign has definitely created more room for Al-Qaeda who have therefore increased their presence in Yemen. And then throughout the Obama administration and then recently, the United States continues, to target al-Qaeda targets, principally with drone campaigns, but the one change that we've seen since Trump came in was that there were American SEALs on the ground, and we lost an American naval officer. So that's an escalation and an increase in the American involvement. So the irony here is that the United States is involved in fighting against both of two mortal enemies. So there's al-Qaeda, the radical Sunni militias, jihadists, and there's the Houthis, the ostensibly, or Shia, again, that's a little bit more complicated than I'm making it sound. They themselves hate one another and are fighting against one another, and the United States' role is to try to kill both of them. What could possibly go wrong? And that's where we stand right now. And kind of my sense of it is, and I didn't look to see what time it was when I started talking, so I don't know how long I've been talking. My sense of it is that this has been a very secret war, again, that most people are dimly aware of, if at all. The Times does cover it a bit. The Post, you wouldn't know. NPR hasn't heard of it. The NewsHour on PBS has not heard of it. I'm very undercover. But my hunch is that now that, in particular, there's a more active U.S. engagement, and it's increasingly kind of clear that actually we're fighting, again, the United States is fighting both sides, that it may become something that you will be like, oh, I remember when I didn't know about this, but now it needs some attention. Just one last thing, I think, compared with Syria, Yemenis have nowhere to go. So Somalia is their best bet. They can't go overland into Saudi Arabia, which is obviously not going to accept them. Oman is more or less neutral in this, but not letting large numbers of Yemenis come over the border. And other than that, you're talking about the Indian Ocean or into the war zones in East Africa. So although the number of internally displaced people is really problematic, no one is seeing the same flood of refugees, which attracts so much international attention. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, it is very, very upsetting. And maybe later I'll come in and ask some policy questions, what we should be asking for, but I think you've really laid out the situation excellently. So now I think Gabe Huck is going to talk more about his co-author and life partner, Teresa, about Syria.
This seldom happens.
So you thought that maybe things were complicated in Yemen, and now let's hear about how simple they are in Syria. Gabe, by the way, is a long-time peace activist, spent a long time in Chicago as a publisher. So it was with great trepidation that I took on the job of publishing the book that he and Teresa wrote about the 7 years that they spent in Syria from 2005 to 2012, when their main motivation was to go and do what they could to, as they say in the book, provide reparations to some of the million Iraqi refugees who were then in Syria, who were refugees from our war that we had launched in Iraq. So their book is an amazing record of those days and of life in Syria. So much sad has happened in the 5 years since you left. What can you tell us about the US war and everything else, Gabe?
Okay, that's what I tried to do was pull together, which is not, it's been in pieces in anything we've done, something of the answer to the U.S. Syria, because it can seem peripheral in one sense, at least before they began bombing in the country, and to try to, you know, pull out of that what we've forgotten or never knew about U.S. behavior toward Syria. And I'm just, as long as I have it, I'm just going to run through some of that. Yeah, you know, every time we came back for a while in the summer, people we didn't know were chatting with here or there and talk about, you know, we've been in Syria and we're, you know, going to be going back and whatnot, would ask, are you safe there? And it's interesting to think that, yeah, we always told them we feel totally safe there. We love it there. But the people asking probably didn't ever realize how much reason they had to ask because of the way the U.S. has treated Syria for a long time. And that's what I want to, and up to the present, want to run through or get as far as I can anyhow. Syria wasn't its own country until after World War II, when the French finally gave up their mandate or occupation of the country and left. And it's been, it was almost immediately, or at least within the decade after being a new country, and you got to remember 2 years after that, the creation of Israel and the flight of Palestinians, many of whom came to and are still in greater numbers in Syria. The meddling of the U.S. was from the 50s, at least part of that. The two CIA people who had overseen the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran were sent there because of interest in a pipeline coming through Syria that long ago, getting the outcome that the U.S. wanted, and tried to organize a coup there, and failed. One of them was taken prisoner and so on. The U.S. first denied everything, but Syria purged cooperating people from the government, and the U.S. Sixth Fleet sailed into the Mediterranean off the coast of Syria and tried to push Turkey toward invading. After that, the CIA worked with the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And at the point where Syria was moving toward closer relationships with Russia, the Cold War, and at the same time was, I think this is generally accepted now, preparing Iraq next door for Saddam Hussein to take power there. Though the Ba'ath Party in both countries, they were never much at peace with each other. The 1967, the war with Israel. Israel seizes the Golan, the Golan Heights, and which is never recognized by the rest of the world, but they're still there, and Syria is out of that. And the UN has, for most of those years, kept a neutral strip in the middle. The U.S. began its annual list of sponsors of state sponsors of terrorism in 1979. Syria is the only country who has never been off the list. Why are they thinking you might have a hard time in Syria? Syria was, when Syria entered the Lebanese civil war, it seems to me, and I'm not the expert, some of those here are, that it in general is credited with having an outcome that led toward at least truce and perhaps getting on with things there. But the determination of the U.S. that Syria invaded and was holding Lebanon, or ruling Lebanon, really, I can't speak towards, but it doesn't seem that that's the situation. But it comes to ahead again with the assassination in 2005 of Hariri in Lebanon, who was not at that time in any position of governing, and the U.S. rushed to blame that on Syria, and insisting that the UN create a special commission to investigate, which went on and on through the years that we were there. We came there right after soon after the assassination, and as that thing worked its way through and ever came back again. It isn't so much of was the U.S. pointing toward the real culprit or not, but pushing this case against Syria. And from that year, 2005, after Hariri's assassination, until 2011, I think, maybe 10, we pulled our ambassador from Syria, and most of the years we were there, there was no U.S. ambassador to Syria. Syria did not reciprocate, as sometimes happens, by pulling their ambassador from the U.S. When we begin to invite people to come and visit us in Syria from the U.S., many of whom did come and were amazed at what a wonderful population and place it was. But some of them would tell us, but we looked at the website of the State Department or the Homeland Security, one or the other, where you're given a severe warning about traveling to Syria, and told such things as, be sure you never take the same path twice from your hotel to wherever you're going. I mean, it could not be further from the reality that we experienced, and that many others have too. There were small good things about the U.S. presence there that I think people favored. The embassy is a huge fortress-like structure, but the American Language Center that the embassy sponsored did a lot of good and was received favorably, like the British Council and the Cervantes Center with Spanish and the Goethe Center with German. Russia had by far the largest cultural center there, and when people today wonder why is Russia coming to the help of the regime there, they may be, we wouldn't agree with it at all, but to understand how many Syrians were educated in Russia through those decades of that Cold War, and not in the U.S., and came back, many married Russian women, and because most of it was men who went to Russia, and partly that was a concern of Russia in the fighting as it broke out, but no clear vision of that here. Shortly, 2011 was when the violence, when the protest, and then the state violence against the protesters began in Syria in March of 2011. It was also around that time that WikiLeaks released cables which showed that the U.S. had been funding opposition to the al-Assad regime in various typical ways for the U.S. to do that, but putting money never, publicly revealed into television and radio programs and undermining the regime. There was some brightness to the whole thing in 2007 when Nancy Pelosi visited Syria and met with Assad, and Condoleezza Rice was, I think it was perhaps in that same year, met with the foreign secretary. As the U.S. Continued to occupy Iraq, which is about a 400-mile border with Syria, we were constantly pushing Syria, and maybe that's what some of those visits were about, to better control that border so that people weren't coming in to help the opposition in Iraq. The one thing that stayed with us, because we were there with U.S. helicopters crossed the border, came into a small town near the border in Syria, landed the helicopters and killed 8 people in that town. The Americans, never said anything, I think, officially, but unofficially were giving the word that they were after potential fighters entering into Iraq, but it was people living in that village who were killed. That set off more anti-American feeling, I guess, than we saw practically at any time before the movement against the government there started. And it resulted in Syria taking steps, closing down for a period of time a school run by the U.S. Embassy from there, and even the American Language Center, and huge demonstrations of people, which are always painted here as government-sponsored in Damascus. But this was one time where they didn't have to be government-sponsored. I think people were angry. Let's see, well, I better stop. I think I can pull it up in the present in some other ways. Can I just say about this?
Just quickly.
This recent book, The Battle for Syria by Christopher Phillips, a British historian. It has a lot to say about how the struggle, from much sooner than most was seen with troops on the ground and attacks by Russia and attacks by the US and attacks by Turkey from the air, how much before that both the regional powers, especially Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Iran, Turkey, as well as Russia, and then the US were involved in it. And it seems, I haven't seen that much of what anyone else is saying about the account here, and it goes far beyond that into looking at what this has been all about, and those powers and those relationships, U.S. relationship to Saudi Arabia, again, U.S. relationship to Qatar, U.S. To Iran, to Hezbollah, all influencing what is happening there as this country that we had come to love the people so much has suffered these 6 years of this constant strife. We have tried to stay in touch. We visited with refugees who are in Turkey, but it's the story of what is happening there has been made so much worse. I guess the one step which seemed crucial is when Kofi Annan and later, when he resigned, came to be the peacemaker in the early, within the first year and into the second year of the struggle, and tried to gather people who had some stake in what was happening there. And that was when, after kind of edging toward it for so long, that Obama and Secretary of State Clinton made it clear that if they would not have any part if Assad was still in office. And whatever you might feel about him, it seems that's not the way things are done. But because we would not follow through at that moment, there's one very tiny quote here.
I think we need to.
Okay, I'm sorry. Brahimi, who took Kofi Annan's place as mediator after that. Everybody had their agenda, and the interests of the Syrian people came second, third, or not at all in those negotiations.
Thank you. David Swanson is a well-known long-time peace activist. He's the founder and director of an organization called World Beyond War that has a great website that I urge people to visit. And he's published a number of books about war, one of which I'm proud that Just World Books published, called War is a Lie. There's another one called War is a Crime. And don't think you have much good to say about war, David. So tell us what there is to say about the U.S. current wars in the Middle East.
Thank you, Helena. I can
Just
say some.
before you start, I wonder if I could ask Christopher to point that light over here so that we get some more light. Maybe to point it down so it'll glare in our eyes and we'll be.
Oh yeah, you'll love that.
Thank you so much.
So thank you, and I'm very glad to be here and to be learning a great deal about Yemen and Syria. Wonderful information. If you want positive comments, I'll talk about peace. But if you want to talk about war, I'm not going to be very cheerful. I wrote down some remarks this morning to see what I can fit in 12 minutes. So forgive me reading them. The first point I want to touch on is this idea that the Middle East is a culturally violent place that can be made less violent by bombings. The first problem with this is that bombing places makes them more violent, not less. Nobody is shocked and awed into non-violence. Not 14 years ago, not for the past century. The second problem is that the Middle East's violence cannot be compared with that of other cultures without figuring out how to factor out the influence of the West. 100 years ago, Britain and France carved up Western Asia, and not to spread democracy. The West has been propping up brutal kings and dictators ever since. Outside of Israel, which is essentially a Western colony, the Middle East does not manufacture weapons. Just as the West once pushed opium on China or alcohol on the native peoples of this land we're sitting on, the West pushes weapons on Western Asia. And the top weapons dealer to the world, to poor nations, and to Middle Eastern nations is the United States, with records set under President Obama likely to be smashed under Trump. Virtually all the weapons used in all the wars around the world, and all the major wars around the world apart from Afghanistan, if you don't count it, and Mexico, are in the Middle East and Northeast Africa, come from 6 nations. They are the 5 permanent members and saboteurs of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany. They are the nations that will be working hard to defeat and disrupt the treaty negotiations beginning Monday in New York to ban nuclear weapons. They are also the nations whose weapons dealers profit from the blood of millions of innocent people, too far away to see and too valueless to be reported on US television. Yesterday, a racist drove up to New York City to kill black men, thinking that would make big news. He forgot that someone white might be attacked in London. At the same time, the US government was busy murdering people by the scores in the Middle East. Guess which of these 3 killing sprees is labeled terrorism? And which other 2 see the media slander the victims and completely ignore the terror and trauma to the survivors? Imagine being a black man walking in Manhattan today. Imagine being anyone living in the Middle East today. U.S. weapons flow to Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Turkey, not to mention Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and to non-governmental organizations that the U.S. government itself calls terrorists in places like Syria. Most, if not all, forces against which these weapons are used also use U.S. weapons, previously given, sold, traded, or stolen. The U.S. military brings its own weapons to Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia, and in fact every single nation of the region, plus the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the skies above, with the possible exception of what's left of Palestine, to which genocidal cause the United States philanthropically donates billions of dollars of weapons to the Orwellianly named Israeli Defense Forces. Each overthrow that the U.S. leads, including those in Iraq and Libya, leads to massive proliferation of weapons, creating chaos and death as far off as places like Mali. But of course, the people of the region appreciate the effort, right? About as much as the people of Ferguson appreciate the police force. The global policeman, headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, is less popular in the places policed than a congressman at a healthcare rally. In December 2013, Gallup surveyed 65 countries around the world, and most said the United States was the greatest threat to peace on earth. In 8 countries in or near the Middle East, where the question was asked, 4 said the United States was the greatest threat to peace, 3 placed the U.S. second behind Israel, and 1, Afghanistan, placed the U.S. second behind Pakistan. It's nice to be appreciated. And it wouldn't take much to actually be appreciated. Stop selling weapons, stop giving weapons, stop bringing weapons, withdraw troops, send food, medicine, farm equipment, clean energy equipment. Doing that would cost a tiny fraction of what it costs to continue making everything worse. Trump says the U.S. initiated wars of the past 16 years have made everything worse, so we should have more of them. He's drone murdering at 4 times Obama's pace, though he has yet to declare a successful drone war as Obama did in Yemen. He's moving more troops into Syria and Kuwait, and he wants to defund everything else to fund a yet more expensive military. Charlottesville City Council, to its great credit, has opposed this, but one of its 5 members would only do so if the resolution pretended that all the killing protects U.S. rights. When we get to questions and answers here, I would love for someone to explain to me how murdering Yemeni children gives me more rights, and how demonstrating inside a free speech cage instead of out in the open as we used to do constitutes an expansion of my freedoms. The mayor of Charlottesville refused to support the resolution because it mentioned the U.S. military, and he would like some higher office purchased for him in the future. Several weeks back, both the ACLU and CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, on the same day, sent out national fundraiser emails quoting a Gold Star father from Charlottesville, claiming that U.S. war-making in Iraq serves to protect the Bill of Rights. These are organizations whose entire purpose is to oppose some of the symptoms of war, yet they promote the wars because they have so internalized the propaganda that they literally cannot imagine questioning it. That is the purpose of my book, War is a Lie, which Helena's company was so good to publish, to encourage questioning. Questioning of the sort that stopped the bombing of Syria in 2013 and supported a treaty with Iran in 2015, but completely fell apart and inserted its head into its posterior the moment an ISIS video was shown on television. Mike Signer is not the only coward among us. Our entire foreign policy and public budget are shaped by irrational fear. More likely than an ISIS member killing you are each of the following: a U.S. police officer killing you, the stairs in your home killing you, pollutants in your environment killing you, a toddler who finds a gun killing you, or Donald Trump retweeting you. I make no comment on which of these fates would be the worst. As you have heard about Yemen and Syria, let me add quickly a couple of comments about Afghanistan and possibly, if there's time, Iraq. The current U.S. war in Afghanistan is into its 16th year, though U.S. violence began there much earlier than that. The U.S. military now has approximately 8,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, plus 6,000 other NATO troops, 1,000 mercenaries and another 26,000 contractors, of whom about 8,000 are from the US. That's 41,000 people engaged in a foreign occupation of a country 15 years after the accomplishment of the stated mission of overthrowing the Taliban government. Afghanistan is the most heavily bombed country of all current US wars, the bulk of that bombing done under President Obama, who also tripled the level of US troops in Afghanistan before reducing them. During each of the past 15 years, our government in Washington has informed us that success was imminent. And during each of those years, Afghanistan has continued its descent into poverty, violence, environmental degradation, and instability. Obama has also, by the way, possibly permanently killed the peace movement, not just shut it off until a Republican entered the White House. Possibly when a Republican in the White House starts a brand new big war, there will be a reviving of the peace movement. It remains to be seen. The United States is spending $4 million an hour on planes, drones, bombs, guns, and overpriced contractors in Afghanistan, which needs food and farm equipment. Thus far, the United States has spent nearly $800 billion with virtually nothing to show for it except the death, injury, and displacement of millions of Afghans, and the death of thousands of US soldiers, plus the injury of tens of thousands, and the endangerment of the people of the United States, the erosion of our rights, the shame of Guantanamo, and the destruction of the Earth's environment. Before Faisal Shahzad tried to blow up a car in Times Square, he had tried to join the war against the United States in Afghanistan. In numerous other incidents, terrorists targeting the United States have stated their motives as including revenge for the US terrorism in Afghanistan, along with other US wars in the region. In addition, Afghanistan is the one nation where the US is engaged in a major war in a country that is a member of the International Criminal Court, which has now announced that it is investigating possible prosecutions of US crimes in Afghanistan. Over the past 15 years, we have been treated to an almost routine repetition of scandals: hunting children from helicopters, blowing up hospitals with drones, urinating on corpses, all fueling anti-US propaganda, all brutalizing and shaming the United States. US and allied soldiers now being ordered into Afghanistan were in preschool on September 11th, 2001, attending preschool. Ordering young American men and women into a kill-or-die mission that was accomplished 15 years ago is a lot to ask. Expecting them to believe in that mission is too much. That fact may help explain this one. The top killer of US troops in Afghanistan is suicide. The second highest killer of US military in Afghanistan is Afghans being trained by the US military, killing their trainers. Candidate Trump said, "Let's get out of Afghanistan. Our troops are being killed by the Afghans we train and we waste billions there. Nonsense, rebuild the USA," end quote. President Trump is acting contrary to every bit of that. I had some remarks on Iraq as well as on activism, but I may be out of time.
You're back. Well, give us the short version of activism.
Short version of activism. Well, join every organization you possibly can, including World Beyond War. I will pass this around if anybody wants to start it. April 4th is going to be 50 years since Martin Luther King spoke against war, and 100 years since the United States Senate voted for a war to end all wars, and they've been trying to use war to end all wars ever since. There are events planned everywhere. April 4th, go to worldbeyondwar.org to find them. April 29th, there is going to be an enormous People's Climate March on Washington, D.C., and we pushed and hassled and harangued them until they agreed to mention peace. It is typical of these supposedly cross-issue coalition movements. Scientists' march, the women's march, none of them have any sort of preference for peace over war. But the climate march was for literally everything. They claim to be for everything. Labor rights, gay rights, everything is somehow about the climate except peace. So we, went after them publicly until they agree. So there is going to be not just a labor march and every other group march into one common march, but a peace rally and march there in DC on April 29th. You should take part in these events once we, manage to get them to happen. I was discussing earlier with someone here who took an online course we taught last year at World Beyond War on, in part on activism, in part on how to make the case for the total abolition of war. And we are teaching a better, improved, expanded online course on these topics starting up in a few weeks. So you can go to worldbeyondwar.org and register. One initiative that I will mention is this, there's a sign-on letter that started going around organizations and prominent individuals, and a corresponding resolution that we have now passed in Charlottesville, a version of, after New Haven passed a version, Prince George's County, Maryland has passed a version saying, no, we don't like the Trump budget proposal of moving money out of everything else into the military. We want to do the exact opposite, move money out of the military into everything else. And I think if we can get lots of towns and cities and counties and states to pass that, and that message, it's educational and it's important and it's potentially effective. This budget is not going to fly through for a number of reasons, and we can reshape it for the better. But the movement being pushed by the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party organizations, and the resolutions already passed in places like Pittsburgh and Ann Arbor, is this tired old predictable pretense of we're against cutting this, and cutting this, that gives people the impression that Trump has proposed cutting things. He has not proposed cutting a single goddamn thing. He has proposed moving money from everything good and decent in the world into the military. He has proposed the exact same size budget as the year before. No cuts, moving. It's not a question of what size government, but what type of government. And so because everybody just says no cuts, and is afraid to mention the existence of the US military, while Trump is pushing to give it up over 60% of discretionary spending, unseen since Reagan, people are misinformed. And you get these poor souls who stumble into the Charlottesville City Council meeting and cheer for Trump's smaller government and cuts and fiscal responsibility. The fiscal responsibility of moving all the money into the one department that's never audited. So, it actually matters what type of resolution is passed, and we need to to stop this silly debate over big government or small government and create a debate over what type of government, and get that kind of message passed by organizations and local governments.
Great, some great suggestions. I want to open things up to questions from the floor, because I'm sure people have a lot of questions about all of these things. So first of all, anybody who would like to ask a question? Maybe it's all just too much, a lot to absorb. I happen to have a question about Yemen. I heard that there was some senators who were starting to ask for some accountability for US complicity in the war in Yemen. What's happened to that? Is it something that we can push further forward? What should we be asking for, and what's happening in Congress on Yemen?
It was 3 senators, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't have their names. It's Lou,
Chris Murphy, I think, was one.
Murphy, and, pardon?
Sorry, I'm forgetting his name too, the senator from Oregon.
Yeah, I think so. Wyden? Yeah, okay, sorry. Didn't answer that question very well. But I think it went nowhere. I mean, then there was where Obama supposedly decided that, well, maybe we could pause the transfer of weapons, but that was, I think, more for show than anything else. So it kind of shut down what was going to be, anyway, a very small voice from Congress on this matter. And, actually, when Bernie was running, you know, I kept thinking, okay, why doesn't he go after the military-industrial complex? You know, why doesn't he raise the question of why, you know, the main export of the United States are killing machines, and the environmental consequences of that, and the foreign policy consequences of
And
that,
human rights.
and the human rights consequences of that, and the fact that, you know, that the main purchasers are this incredibly despicable house of salaries. And, you know, as I thought about it myself and then talked to other people, I think what we recognized is that in almost every constituency, for almost every member of Congress in the entire country, there is some branch of the military-industrial complex. In other words, there are local interests in the manufacture of weapons and the sale of those weapons, in particular to the Middle East.
So it's a jobs program.
It is indeed military Keynesianism, right? That whose kind of, you know, raison d'etre is that, you know, unlike any other industry where you wouldn't want to be sort of deliberately, you know, subsidizing jobs, you can do that in the military industrial complex with, you know, a lot of support for Congress. And so those three individuals in Congress, you know, were kind of bravely raising this question, but I think they must have gotten, maybe not the identical reasoning that I walked through and talked to my friends and colleagues and comrades about, but, you know, they must also recognize, and surely most of the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate know that they're not going to get local support for what would be, in effect, a job slashing policy. And, you know, this is one of the reasons why I'm incredibly pessimistic about the possibility for the sorts of policies that you're speaking so eloquently about, because I think that, you know, there's a reason why Obama, who I think went in thinking, oh, I could be a peace president, and instead he turned into like the arms merchant in chief. And certainly Clinton was prepared to be that as well. And then again, Sanders, I think not, but he certainly wasn't prepared to really speak about it. So I think you've hit it on the head with the kind of military Keynesianism.
Depressing. Gabe, I have a really hard question actually about ISIS, because I have Quaker friends who have said that they were not in Syria, but in Iraq, when ISIS exploded into Iraq and into Mosul, who said they were really glad the US military stopped that. What do you think we should be saying about ISIS as people in the peace movement?
Well, first, I suppose we think we should acknowledge our responsibility for the creation of it. And we should, in terms of the coverage and so on given, especially early on, to Daesh or ISIS, with things like the beheadings, is not to use that to inflame people. We don't even let them see the people we kill. It's so unfair in the way that it's given. We generate it with the arrogance and the firepower and the ignorance of the cultures where we live, and then exploit the immersion of something that probably could have been, predicted to have come. If you treat people like that, that's what's going to happen. So, is more bombing going to take it away? It might move it. It might underground. But they've also, it's heading back home. I mean, it's heading to many homes, and it's not. It is not the way out of it. But I don't know that I have any answer. But it's not. It's just is not to continue dealing with it by more violence. And who dies in Mosul? as we move through this, you know. It's the people who still were living there. Something major has to, as others are saying, it has to change. Yeah, I wanna, can I ask one? Sheila, it's only a little ways from Yemen to Somalia and the countries across it, and there's always back and forth and has been forever. I mean, right now that whole is caught in famine, right, or potential famine from South Sudan to Djibouti and the other countries there. What are we just writing them off forever? Do you think, including Yemen, that it doesn't rate with Syria and some of the others?
Yeah, I mean, you know, good observation. I think, you know, it is, they're similar people. I mean, they're not identical, but they're similar people. They have, as you said, they, you know, traffic across there. It's very short distance from Yemen to Somalia. And of course, just this week was it a boatload of Somali refugees who had been, because Yemen still takes in refugees. They've actually always had a very kind of permissive environment for refugees from Vietnam, and then also from Somalia and from the Horn of Africa. But at this point now, some of them are trying to get back home, and this year,
That's the boat that was attacked.
that's the boat that was attacked, were Somali refugees who had been living in Yemen and were trying to get back to Somalia. But yeah, I mean, Yemen has, you know, Somalia, of course, and South Sudan have been facing famine for many years, and of course, any famine is largely a man-made or human-caused phenomenon. But the Yemen famine is very specifically and concretely a product of this war and of an explicit Saudi policy to starve people. I mean, you know, deliberately, for example, bombing the seaports through which foods and medicines come, deliberately bombing the bridges that would allow food and medicine imported to come. So, I mean, I don't think in my lifetime there's been a famine that wasn't, you know, caused by human activity, but I cannot, maybe it's just my knowledge gap, but I mean, I cannot think of a famine which has been so directly caused by intentional policy to starve people into submission.
And is it clear?
Gabe,
Okay.
we had a question.
Okay.
I was just gonna ask, the United States does not seem to have any kind of foreign policy that seems to be moving in a direction that would advance peace in the Middle East. And I'm wondering, are there any other countries that have made policy proposals that may have some credibility with the panel?
Do you wanna?
I mean, you know, at one point, the Netherlands in particular tried to condemn Saudi war crimes in Yemen. And the kingdom threatened to withdraw all its funds from the UN in retaliation, and so the Netherlands was forced to pull that back.
I think Kuwait and Oman have tried to.
Oman, not Kuwait.
A little bit. I mean, there's other Gulf Cooperation Council countries. More Oman. Oman is,
More.
yeah.
On
So
the
it'd
last
be
we
worth
heard,
it to look at what Oman is proposing?
Humanitarian pauses mainly.
But there have been attempts at peace settlements in Syria and elsewhere for years. We heard about the United Nations beginning that effort years ago, and time after time, the United States blocking it with "we will not consider anything until we've overthrown Assad." And we had the former president of Finland a year or two ago saying that back in 2012, Russia had put on the table a peace settlement that would have involved the nonviolent stepping down of Assad from power in Syria, and the United States brushed it aside immediately with a preference for his imminent violent overthrow, right? Even though we know that violent overthrows have worse consequences than nonviolent ones, this was the U.S. delusion that it was imminent, which has gone on for years and probably continues, and the preference for, not for peace in Syria as a priority, but for a Syria without Russia in it as a priority. With a Syria without, I mean, you look at a map of US bases across the world, you look at a map of US weapons sales across the world, and you know, Syria and Iran just jump out at you. This is the problem with those countries. So, you know, there are the vast majority of national governments on earth with an interest in peace in places like Syria. And there have been proposals from governments like Russia that have their own blood up to their shoulders now in Syria. But the United States would benefit everyone just by getting the hell out and doing no further harm.
So, other questions? Scott?
It's great having you all here. I'm especially delighted to see Sheila here. I'm ever grateful to Helen for publishing that collection of those essays, because for the past 6 years I've been using so many of those essays in my teaching, and it was nice to have them all in one place, and then I wouldn't get accused of, oh, you're always having us copy so many articles or things. So it was nice to have them all in one book. And you know, I've used it now 3 semesters, and it's, I have another group. I wish I could have gotten some of the students to come out here, but if we had figured out a way to have them here, or we're getting to Yemen in the next few weeks. Maybe it's partly my nature. I want to find some reason to think that the Saudis will see reason. That there's something out there. I mean, you keep hearing it from wise sources that the Saudis know they can't win this. Do they? Rationally, I'm thinking they know they can't win this. But then, just like what you're talking about, this mass famine and starvation, these horrendous situations that my students from a variety of backgrounds, they read through all those different background articles, and a lot of them are telling me that they're just shaken. It's like shaking the foundations of what they thought U.S. foreign policy was about, what it is we're doing in the region, our so-called allies with the Saudis, and I have to contain my own sarcasm, and David, you may be showing me a way to do it and keep it a little more cheerful. I can't figure out a way to do this. But on the other hand, sometimes it's just letting the facts speak for themselves and let the students wrestle with them. But if I had these students, is there something, do you sense a possibility going into this summer, or is it just, or is if you will, the realism here that we're in a, so far we don't see the realities, and Billy, you might want to jump in here too, but with all your expertise and experience on the Saudis, but from your experience with Yemen, do you see any hope that this could change?
You know, anyway, good to see you too, Scott. Thank you for using the book, and thank you for the question. I think that we tend to use as a shorthand the North Koreans, the Iranians, and also the Saudis. And I think when it comes to the Saudis, it's particularly problematic. So there's the question, did the Saudis back the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the 9/11 hijackers? And the answer is probably not the Saudis, but maybe some of them. You know, individuals and distinguishing. I think that in the current war, there's plenty of Saudis. I happen to have 2 Saudi students at the moment, both of whom are, you know, completely against the Yemen war. And I'm sure that there are plenty of other Saudis, including people in the government, in the royal family, who are looking at this thinking, you know, bad policy. So, but the king and his son seem not to have gotten the memo. And so, you know, then the question becomes, is it possible within the royal family, is it possible also within the Gulf Cooperation Council, you know, for kind of more sober or sensible or decent voices to prevail? And we certainly haven't seen that in the past 2 years, but if you're asking me, can you give me some, shred of optimism, which is I think what you were asking me, then that would be it. Then it would be that somehow within the royal family, within the Saudi military establishment itself, within the Gulf Cooperation Council. Again, I wish I was more optimistic, particularly under Trump, about somebody in Washington getting these people and shaking them. Because of course, otherwise what's going on is that the Saudis just spend money in Washington and buy
think tanks.
obsequiousness, that's right, think tanks and obsequiousness. But again, you're asking me for some optimism, that's the only place I could look for it.
Can I give some optimism?
Oh.
Sure. If you can do it, then do it.
Well, it's if you look at 2013, when Raytheon's stock hit its highest, and every corporate television network knew that every town in Syria was about to be bombed, and both political parties in Washington knew it and wanted it and demanded it on television. And the President of the United States went on television and spoke to the US public and said, watch these YouTubes of these little children being killed with chemical weapons. You are for that, or you're for bombing the hell out of Syria with me. This was not a light sell. This was not a pretense. This was going to happen. Why didn't it? Well, as Obama has admitted, and it is the last thing they ever want to admit, largely, principally because of public pressure. That included the public pressure of the Europeans and getting the Parliament in London to vote against the war for the first time since Yorktown, and the pressure on Congress. Remember, this was like a perfect storm. It was Jewish holidays. AIPAC was gone. It was Congress members out to their districts and town hall meetings, and people saying, now explain to me why we're supposed to get in a war on Al Qaeda's side now. And the calls and the emails and the petitions
We
dwarfed.
actually had a fantastic
I
meeting
remember
here.
In this room,
Yes.
in every other room in this country, we had forums on this, and it got people's
Yeah,
attention
it-
despite a
People were
Democratic
hanging from
president.
the rafters
I was
in
one.
September
And
2013.
you had Republicans and Democrats opposing the same thing, even though they hated each other. Now, very partial victory, not some sort of principled stand for small d democracy. In the polls, people were even more against arming proxies, and they went right ahead with fueling the bad situation and planning, other propaganda campaigns and escalations. It was a moment to switch from doing everything wrong to doing everything right. That didn't happen. But what was supposed to happen was stopped by public pressure, as proposals to launch a war on Iran and to resist a treaty with Iran have been stopped by public pressure over and over again. And that will never go in any history book, wars that didn't happen, The whistleblowers in Washington are multiplying like rabbits. There is resistance. Judges, courts, the judicial branch of governments in this country have started noticing crimes and outrages in a way that you would think would have happened like 15 years ago, but didn't. The people are turning out at airports for refugees, and some of them are noticing where the refugees are coming from and why. So this idea that all is hopeless and we're powerless is, this is the number one lie. This, in my book, War is a Lie, I go through the types of lies that start wars and escalate wars and so forth, but the number one lie that I address there and everywhere is this lie that we're powerless, or that if we're not powerless, the only thing we can do is vote in elections. This is a recipe for suicide, for depression, and for uselessness and apathy, which is the intention. But it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ridiculous. You go back and read the memoirs of any activist from decades gone by, and it's, number one, there's always their best friend who was in the FBI, and number two, there's always the impact they had that they had no idea. That we had a handful of people outside the White House telling Kennedy not to resume nuclear testing. It can't possibly have had any impact until they get the minutes of what was being discussed inside the window and find out and if they...
Or Norman Morrison, the Quaker who immolated himself on the steps of the Pentagon, to the dismay of most Quakers at the time.
Big impact.
And, then Bob McNamara in Fog of War says, that really struck home.
Of course it did. Obviously it would. Logically it would. But we've had it beaten into our heads that we're powerless, or that all we can do is go vote in a broken election system, which is almost worse than being told we're powerless.
So any other questions from the floor? Gabe, I'd love for you to sum up, and then we'll sum up along the row here in just a couple of minutes. What do you think we can do? What do you think are the most important things for people to learn and to take home about Syria?
I get pretty discouraged also with what we can do, because it seems that the failure to in the critique of any of this, that there's some wall that comes up before we point the way David is pointing at the military and at the hegemony over the whole world. And we want to solve these things at home. Some people, will even admit climate change into that and so on. But that good discussions go on a long time without saying. But if we solve that, if we have labor, if we have equality here, the machine goes on. It seems, and I'm not. Is it money? Is it arrogance? Is it fear that if we don't do it, somebody else will? I don't know, but to me, that is to keep pointing out to people that, you got to sit down and you got to study, you got to read, you got to find out why these kinds of things are happening, and take some position on it. It's terrible with Trump, but if what comes of it finally is waking up, then it's worth it.
Thanks. Sheila, what do you think we should do?
All right, so I'm putting David's cap on, okay?
Okay.
What Yemen has going for it that Syria doesn't. Syria, an awful lot of people have very strong opinions. First you have to defeat ISIS, first you have to get rid of Assad, first you have to stop those refugees from swarming into Europe. In Yemen, nobody has any strong feelings that this one or that one needs to be defeated, or that there's something moral or important about this war. Like, nobody has that opinion in the U.S. And there is actually room, I think, for some great sympathy, or maybe the correct word is sort of pity, for the suffering of the people. Again, those who are dying kind of kinetically from war wounds, and then much more slowly from lack of medicine, or lack of food, or other kinds of just deprivations. And so, to the extent that I find room, short of asking the Saudi government to come to its senses, for the United States, or again, people in other countries, whether it's Canada or Italy or, Australia or Zimbabwe, or Venezuela, in other words, all kinds. But there is room, I think, for a realization that this is particularly senseless, given that nobody does have strong opinions that first this or that party has to be defeated or killed or knocked off the face of the earth, but just a sense that maybe it really is senseless, and that it is predominantly a humanitarian crisis, because we do have history of people kind of rallying around a humanitarian cause, at least sometimes, Ethiopia or Bangladesh, get the Beatles, have a concert.
Is that about to happen for Yemen? I mean,
no, I don't think it is, but, again, I'm trying to channel David.
Okay.
And maybe that's where I should be going with this. Maybe, I should pick out an artist or two and see if I can't get them to do a concert.
Bono.
You too.
Bono
Yeah, there
or-
you go.
I have to think about that. See yeah, all right, I kind of like that idea. I think I might have to think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, focusing on the starvation threat without mentioning war to certain individuals and organizations and funders is a way to go. And then sort of bring in the fact that the United Nations has said some 30 billion, maybe it's going up, but let's say 50 billion would end starvation on the entire planet. And the fact that, let's blame it all on Trump, he's the least popular guy around. Donald Trump has proposed, over $700 billion for continuing to make the problem worse. That scale, I mean, get a graphic of that contrast, because $700 billion, and it's closer to $1 trillion when you add in every department, and past debts for the crime, for making matters worse, for creating the starvation. This is not something justifiable because the Iranians are spending a tiny fraction of 1% of it, or the Russians who have cut their military spending from 1/10 of it down to 8% of it. The other thing I would mention, the Progressive Caucus in Congress and Barbara Lee, who you can usually rely on, the Progressive Caucus you usually can't, have both made good statements about military spending and useful spending in recent days, and should be encouraged and spread to other Congress critters. And I wanted to mention on this topic of the jobs program, 2 things. One, I watched a panel with Vladimir Putin and the former ambassador, the last ambassador from the US to the Soviet Union, on which he told Putin not to worry about any of the US military buildup in Europe, that it was purely a jobs program for back in the States. And Putin correctly said, well, why don't you have a different kind of jobs program? And had I been on the stage in the former ambassador's shoes, I would have pointed out the studies from places like the University of Massachusetts Amherst that show that in fact military spending is not a jobs program, and it is a lie to claim that it is, that in fact it produces fewer jobs not only than all sorts of other kinds of spending on energy, education, and so on, but then tax cuts. Not taxing the money from working people in the first place produces more jobs than military spending. It is a drain, it is a negative. Our mayor of Charlottesville's inability to comprehend that was a factor in his concoction of false justifications for why he wasn't backing a resolution here. But I would also mention again that starting Monday in New York, most nations on this globe are meeting to draft a treaty to ban nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Up against the opposition of the United States, the other big weapons dealers, and their proxies. And this should be encouraged with everything we've got, as if our lives depended on it, which they might.
Well, thank you all very much. We just have to keep on raising awareness, showing people what the effects of our country's militarism is, and slowly, who knows which of these seeds will take root. And I want to thank all of you for your real commitment and intelligence and compassion, and for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we do have the books over there. I'm going to